All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Deric Tilson, an energy economist and the senior nuclear energy analyst at the Breakthrough Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Derek.
Happy to be here.
All right, now we've got a lot of nuclear topics to discuss. So nuclear energy has been getting a lot more attention in the past few years, I would say, both from people who are looking to expand low carbon energy sources and from people who simply want to see more reliable baseload energy in general. And and we saw the first new reactors in many years in this country come online in, I believe it was 2024 down in Georgia. Um, so the opening question, are we entering, as some observers have predicted, a nuclear renaissance in the United States?
So often we've entered or been about to enter a nuclear renaissance. I don't like using the word because it always seems a little far out of reach. Or we'll get just to the line where we think we're going to cross over and build a bunch of nuclear, and then something happens, whether it's Fukushima or what have you, and like we retract for a few years. We are on the precipice or potentially are on the precipice of seeing a lot more nuclear being built. I think at this time there are more nuclear startups than there have ever been before. The microreactor is an exciting space, or microreactor realm is an exciting space. Small modular reactors also an exciting space. Lots of movement happening there. Um, Unfortunately, we're also at a time of economic uncertainty, and we don't know what's going to happen with the new administration and what policies are going to be passed down. It seems to be a mix. Like they say, like the Trump administration has said, they want energy dominance in it and want to support nuclear. Unfortunately, the policies that they have been passing or proposed passing seem to conflict with one another. And so I think that like we could be on the verge of much more nuclear being built, but there's a lot of uncertainty at the same time.
Mhm. So, and there's a lot of sort of incumbent regulation in history where sort of whatever happens next is supposed has to a bit struggle with what burdened by what has been
Yes. Yeah.
to use a phrase. So from the last election, uh there's just a huge amount of government regulation in general that governs how nuclear energy in particular is licensed and produced and all that sort of thing.
Mm.
And a lot of that is controlled now by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the government that replaced the old agency, the Atomic Energy Commission, back in 1974. The modern era, so the past 50 years or so, uh, that's a lot of material. But how would you grade the NRC's performance as a for a government agency that has has a certain set of jobs it's supposed to do? What grade would you give the incumbent history of the NRC really live today?
Sure. And I think it depends on what criteria you want to grade them on, right? If we look at safety, I think the NRC has done an excellent job um, providing like a huge or a huge regulatory body to ensure safety of nuclear reactors. If we're looking at construction and production of nuclear reactors, which the NRC only has like the mandate to provide the regulatory structure and not to promote. The Department of Energy is supposed to promote, but the truth is the NRC has only licensed and built two reactors in the last 50 years. Um, and in some way, I wonder what the long-term plan is for the NRC, or what they have thought it was over the past 50 years. I studied public choice, and that was one of my specializations in grad school. And something that you think that something you learn in public choice from your bureaucracy. Bureaucracy exists, or part of its production function, part of its utility function is to continue existing.
Mhm.
And eventually, if you don't build nuclear reactors and all your old nuclear reactors are decommissioned, then the regulatory body cannot function. It has no purpose anymore. Um, and so I think that the NRC has been too conservative. However, in the past several years, we've seen movement to streamline the NRC. Part of this was through the 2019 NEMA Act and the 2024 Advance Act,
Mhm.
which Congress imposed and told the NRC, like, hey, you have to streamline your processes. You have to modernize your regulatory instructions and your regulations. And we have seen movement there. So I think like like while the past 50 years might not have been the best for the industry or the best in terms of like getting nuclear out there, the next 3 to 5 years look very promising.
Well, yeah, I know you have a similar set of incentives, I feel like, in some other regulatory agencies people are familiar with, like the Food and Drug Administration, right? The Food and Drug Administration is charged with making sure that dangerous drugs and medical treatments don't get out there and harm people. But of course, the only way to ensure that there is zero chance of any harm ever is to approve zero drugs and treatments, and obviously we don't want that. So
Exactly.
um,
Yeah.
it always seems like a sort of dynamic equilibrium where we need to keep rebalancing. Um, so I guess you know, are there really specific changes, like you mentioned, like the Advance Act and some recent guidance from Congress, but are there like big obvious things that we think we need Congress to do to say, unleash this new opportunity for nuclear innovation, or is it just the NRC needs to sort of rebalance its priorities?
So there are a whole host of things that can be done, both from the congressional side and from the NRC. Um, First off, I think the Congress should consider their oversight of the implementation of the Advance Act. There's so many good policies that are push forward there and ideas, and the NRC should implement them. And the NRC is known for having a very conservative culture when it comes to change. And so I think it's important to have that congressional oversight for Congress to check up and make sure that these things are being implemented. Recently, the NRC changed their mission statement, um, and that was a huge progress. And the NRC needs to take the ideas behind the mission statement and ensure that there is continuity across all of its departments and teams in the implementation. Um, Other things that could be changed. So the NRC has a very strict um, risk tolerance for radiation dosage and the kind of potentials for accidents. That's far stricter than the EPA's. We should align the NRC's risk with EPA's risks according to the 1990 Clean Energy Act amendments, right? There's what's called an ample margin of safety.
Mhm.
And at this point, the NRC is the ample margin of safety is absolutely no tolerance for risk at all. When in fact we can't ever truly get rid of all risk.
Mhm.
We have to accept some level of risk. And when you're considering something like energy, no matter what kind of energy production you have, there's always going to be some kind of risk. You may not know this, but the most dangerous form of energy production in terms of lives lost is hydroelectric dams. And they are not regulated nearly to the extent
Mhm.
that nuclear reactors are.
Mhm.
And that's indirect deaths. If we start thinking about indirect deaths, such as through pollution, whether it's a coal plant or a natural gas plant or any kind of other fossil fuel burning, um, there are far more indirect deaths caused through emissions and pollution via those than what has ever been caused through any kind of nuclear related accident.
So you mentioned some other government agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Energy. So even though the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has the prime, is the prime mover here when it comes to all these issues, some of these other federal government agencies may have some sort of impact as well. How would that work in the future for as far as encouraging more nuclear production?
Sure. And so the NRC and the DoD are the only two agencies that can license a nuclear reactor. Obviously, the Navy has plenty of nuclear reactors along their submarines and aircraft carriers, and then the NRC is the main regulatory body for any kind of commercial or non-commercial nuclear reactor. Other agencies have impacts here as well. They can't license them, but they can have positive impacts on the prolifer. I don't want to use the word proliferation. I don't know if you can cut that. On the deployment of nuclear energy. So the first obvious one would be FERC, which regulates interstate transmission of electricity and regulates all of the regional transmission operators and the ISOs, or what you think of as the grid. Um, and so they could allow for co-located resources, which means that you could have a nuclear reactor sitting beside a data center, and the data center would pull power from the nuclear reactor, and whatever the data center doesn't use, it could send that energy to the grid. Allowing that would be huge for allowing more deployment of nuclear energy. And that way, the data centers and other things will not have to be off the grid entirely, and they can provide services to the grid, such as voltage regulation, frequency regulation, and so on. Um, the Department of Energy has what's called the Loan Program Office, which has the authority to um, authority to be an intermediary between nuclear developers and the federal financing bank, and they help consult the federal financing bank on risk and bringing those two together. And so allowing for more loans to go through the more developers to take loans to the federal financing bank via the loan program office be a huge boon, especially because these loans can be taken at a lower interest rate than private loans, um, which is great for nuclear energy because nuclear energy has long time horizons. And generally, the government also has long time horizons. And so there's this like match.
Mhm.
Um, and like EPA, of course, has standards for risk and for radiation risks. The NRC should adopt those, or Congress should mandate that the NRC adopt those, frankly.
Mhm.
Um, and then the Department of Defense could also produce more, um, invest more in nuclear. They have like Project Pele, Project Marvel, where they're making microreactors to support bases that are far off and away from the grid. And so if you have these microreactors being built and then you power a whole base, have reliable, firm power, right? And having them purchase um, more microreactors would obviously like prop up the space. And finally, the federal government as a whole um, could engage in purchase power agreements with nuclear power, saying, okay, we know that nuclear is carbon free, it has a low environmental footprint, and so we're going to mandate that whichever departments or whichever agencies need to procure at least 20% of their power from nuclear and have
Mhm.
those purchase power agreements.
Right. And and of course, in addition to all of our friends at the federal level, we have this wonderful and occasionally frustrating system of federalism in this country. So we have all the state governments, and they have, certain powers and responsibilities as well.
Mhm.
And so the high level energy policy is generally set at the federal level through all the agencies we just talked about. Um, but electricity and like utility operations are regulated by the 50 states. They have all of their electricity, their utility service commissions, public service commissions. They're slightly different names in different states. Um, and even on top of that, we have some regional multi-state compacts that have to impact energy use. So we have clusters of states that have made agreements. Uh, I guess the question is, are all of these people working together, or do they need to be? Should they be?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And as it is, every state can have different policies. Oftentimes, you'll have like states with the states that control their own policies are usually in regulated markets where the state regulates the entire market. There's not necessarily interregional transmission, or if there is, it's under the formation of a larger regional entity. And then you have deregulated markets, which are the ISOs or independent service operators. You have like the New York ISO, MISO, which is mid-continental. You have the ISO New England for the New England states, and so forth. And it would be great if they could work together. Oftentimes, what ends up happening with these kinds of policies, with these kinds of systems, is we have 50 different policies for 50 different states, and they don't work well together. And so often, there's a public choice aspect in this, and that the state lawmakers and the utilities within the state are often in the struggle of finding the best policies for themselves, for their constituents, or for their bottom line, depending on who it is and what time of the election cycle it is. Um, and so states could go a long way in supporting nuclear. Many states still have moratoriums, which means that cannot build nuclear within their state. Some states lately have been passed or have been repealing those moratoriums or voting to repeal them. I think California, I just wrote a comment not too long ago, California was looking to introduce small modular reactors back into their energy mix. Right? They haven't had new nuclear plants in a long time. There's the threat of Diablo Canyon shutting down a couple of years ago. I mean, it's of course still operating, but California, of all the states, could use much more nuclear power than what they have already.
Right. So now, Congress is in the middle of a huge debate. I'm sure all our listeners are familiar with over this big reconciliation bill, the big, beautiful bill that President Trump wants the Republicans to pass in Congress, which is full of all sorts of big, important stuff on tax and spending policy. And one of the major things that a lot of members of the GOP majority want to see get eliminated with this new bill are the energy subsidies and tax credits that were in the Inflation Reduction Act, which former President Biden signed in 2022. And you wrote recently that quote, the repeal of existing tax credits would not ring the death knell for a nuclear resurgence, but it would remove the scaffolding supporting its construction. Uh, Walk us through that, because there's a lot of different provisions,
Yes,
including for purchase of EVs and all sorts of different things that aren't about
sure.
energy production. But what's the nuclear slice of this?
Yeah, so the IRA included lots of spending and lots of investment. And whether you agree with all of it or not, I'm not going to get into it. But what it did was it prioritized commitments to energy resources. And we're living in a time where there's increasing energy demand. For the last 30 years, we've seen fairly stable demand across the past 3 decades. But all of a sudden, with electrification, with the rise of large language models and data centers, we're seeing much more energy being demanded. And the IRA was a forward-thinking policy package of thinking like, well, how can we invest more in these things? And nuclear would have received a lot of investment tax credits and production tax credits through these policies. Um, and so the premature phasing out of those policies is the one big beautiful bill threatens to do, kind of removes this federal focus on nuclear power, this federal push on nuclear power
Mhm.
by phasing it out. And it makes nuclear slightly more expensive. And so we talked about state level policies earlier. And when you look at like state regulated markets or energy markets or ISOs and RTOs, they are looking at the costs of procuring energy over time. Um, and and making nuclear more expensive will mean it's less likely that nuclear will be procured. And some of the credits could be pared back. Some like investment tax credits and production tax credits are great policy levers if you want to help an infantile industry rise up, right? You're like, okay, this needs protecting, but in a few years, we can remove these credits and they'll be self-sufficient, they'll be commercially viable. And we've seen that happen with solar and wind. And I think at this time, like, we can start paring back those tax credits on solar and wind, because as we've seen in many markets, they are commercially viable. They have their use case. Whereas nuclear, especially advanced nuclear products, aren't there yet. Like, we're still in the process of deploying development reactors, but we haven't started building reactors that are commercially viable. And
Mhm.
and like having those tax credits would greatly help along that process and help incentivize states and utilities and consortiums of businesses invest in nuclear.
Well, yeah, no, I definitely heard, plenty of people say that, if we're going to have, tax credits or, subsidies of any kind, they should be for these, first of a kind, new cutting edge technologies. And there's certainly a lot of uh, new technological development and, advances going on in the nuclear sphere. But I guess the question, certainly a lot of like market economists would say, well, how do we know that these infant industries are ever going to grow up? Or how do we know if they've already grown up? Because, right, if I figure if you went to the people who are the biggest promoters of wind and solar, uh, i.e., wind and solar companies, they would probably not be the first people to volunteer and raise their hand and say, "Oh, we're no longer an infant industry. We're fine. Take away all of our subsidies." So you obviously have to depend on some other whether it's Congress or it's some grant approval person at the Department of Energy, whoever it is, to say, well, actually, no, you're a mature technology now. We can taper you off of the taxpayer subsidies. Um, I just wonder, are there any like good guidelines for doing that? Saying like, well, you're now an adolescent technology. You're no longer an infant industry.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think we could use the obvious metrics would be the amount of generation produced within a market region or the United States as a whole, right? So if you said, okay, if advanced nuclear reactors all of a sudden are taking up 10% of the energy market share or electricity generation share, then that means that you've reached the level that you should be commercially competitive. You could also look at cost per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour, right? Like once you get below this threshold, you are now cost competitive with natural gas or other generation sources. And those are the metrics you'd have to look like. Because like you're right, no wind or solar developer in their right mind would say, take these tax credits away from me.
Mm,
Unless they were producing energy for so cheap that removing their tax credits would effectively cut out their competition, right?
mm.
That would be the only other lever that would do that.
You know, so you mentioned SMR, small modular reactors, and that's one of the things I hear most often when it talks about like when people talk about the future of nuclear energy is that maybe in the future we'll have fewer of these like big, large traditional nuclear power plants that we've had for 70 years, and we'll have more of these SMRs, whether it's sort of like you said, like a micro reactor at one particular site to power a small military base, or it's a sort of array of SMRs all in the same location. Um, and there are a bunch of, like you said, a bunch of nuclear startup companies working on stuff like this. But, I've also seen some news that would make me be sort of cautious about it. So there was like this company, NuScale Power, had a big project in Idaho called the Carbon Free Power Project, and it was in development for several years, and it got, I think, at least a couple $100 million taxpayer support for it along the way, and then it was never actually built. Um, Now, the exact details of like how those numbers worked out for them is not necessarily the point. Uh, any project might not pencil out at the end of the day, but how optimistic versus sort of cautious should we be about small modular reactors rolling out? Because I've seen some people say like, oh, well, that's the solution to everything. We'll just build 10,000 SMRs and everyone will be great. But I suspect it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's slightly more complicated than that. I personally am optimistic about the future with SMRs. Um, in the nuclear industry space, there's a first mover disadvantage oftentimes. And and so that's perhaps one reason why the we haven't seen so much movement yet in terms of reactors being built with small modular reactors. There's also really high barriers to entry. It is expensive to go through the licensing process at the NRC. It
Mhm.
takes hundreds of millions of dollars even before you start breaking ground to get through that process. There are many barriers at the state level. There's barriers at the local level with permitting issues. Um, and then we have supply chain issues to boot. So there are many barriers, and we have to get over the hump. And I think like once we start seeing NuScale or some of these other reactor companies building their reactors, once they get the first one built, the second one built, it's going to hopefully get cheaper as they go along. There's going to be learning by doing, there's going to be innovation. There will be the supply chains will start to become more secured. And I think it all comes down to getting over that hump, which is a difficult thing with any new technology, is moving past those initial barriers, especially when the barriers involve high capital costs.
Mm. Well, yeah, and speaking of supply chains, this is to bring up something hopefully that's especially timely on people's minds. The current sort of tariff and trade war that we're in the middle of. Um, there's on one level, there's a very sort of simplistic view of like trade, which is that either we make a product in the United States or we import a finished product from overseas, and those are the two things you can do, right? You can either make it all or import it all. But a lot of the things that we import are actually inputs into other things that are either assembled or made in the United States. So there's a lot of sort of cross, we send stuff over here, that stuff's sent to a third country, then it's assembled into a larger component, then it's, imported back to the United States, and then it's assembled
Mhm.
by, UAW workers in Detroit into a car. Um, so there's some lack of understanding that there's a lot of like cross-border stuff that's not just all made here, all made abroad. But I wonder, how does this impact what we're talking about here, which is energy markets and nuclear stuff, because we have a country that until recently I thought was one of our closest allies, Canada, and we've got interconnections with Canada, energy wise, that are those going to be impacted by our, was it 10 or 25 or
Yeah,
X percent fentanyl cross-border tariffs?
I wrote earlier this year on how the tariffs impact more than just the physical goods that you would buy at the grocery store. It also impacts energy, because we import a lot of energy from Canada. They have excess production of hydroelectric dams, and Quebec and Ontario has wind power and nuclear power that is often sent across the border into Michigan, New York, and Maine to help balance those systems. And like those states I just mentioned, they have deregulated systems where marginal pricing is affected. And marginal pricing just means that that the grid operator is deploying the least cost energy at any given time.
Mhm.
And sometimes Canada has lower energy prices than the United States does. And they'll send that energy over to New York, and it will be distributed amongst the grid, and we'll pay whatever the price is to send it. And it's the lowest energy cost. However, tariffs threaten that. And so earlier this year, that there was a 10% energy tariff on electricity coming from Canada into the United States. And Canada was upset about that. And so they then imposed a 25% export fee. So you would pay 10% on top of the energy being produced, and then an additional 25% on top of that via the export fee, and which would raise prices for American consumers. All of a sudden, we wouldn't be getting, if without the fees, the next cheapest provider of energy was Canada or some generator in Canada, we would bypass that and go to whatever the next least expensive option in the United States was, which would be higher than what Canada's energy prices would be without the tariffs. And so that raises your electricity bill.
Right. Well, so there's a lot of moving parts here between what Congress is going to do in the next few weeks, couple months maybe, and then where the tariff stuff is going to sort out, because we've seen a lot of advances and retreats and back and forth and
Mm.
things being canceled there. So, when it comes to a slightly longer term look into all this stuff, I'm interested in how you and the Breakthrough Institute and your team there, you've got a lot of people working on energy and even on specifically nuclear stuff. Um, how do you balance working on what's happening this week versus where you think the country needs to be in like 5 or 10 years? What is that? How does that work out if you're sitting around in a conference room or a virtual conference room? How do you deploy your energies?
Sure. We have long-term reports and ideas that we're working on. And we do balance those with like having very quick turnaround on new, whether it's legislation or proposed bills, right? Like so the Ways and Means Committee announced the big beautiful bill, the one big beautiful bill earlier this week, and this morning my director and I, Adam Stein, published an article about it. Right, we really quick turnaround. Part of part of this happens that we are a very small organization. Like the nuclear team is 5 people,
Hmm.
and our organization as a whole is under 30 people. And so we are able to move quickly. We are able to be nimble when we need to be nimble. But also we have guiding principles such as eco-modernism and think of like the thoughts of like technological progress while combining environmentalism there, a good environmentalism where humans still have prosperity. And all of these things combined where if we need to stop work on something for a week, We do it. Otherwise, we're looking on longer term projects. We're consulting each other, and each of us has our own areas that we specialize in and that we're working towards all the time.
Great. And I know, and of course, if you want to hear more about how Breakthrough does stuff, you can go back and watch episode 15 of this show, in which Breakthrough's deputy director, Alex Trembath, talks about eco-modernism and abundance. Uh, all right. That sounds like an excellent game plan. And before we wrap up, where can people go to find you and your work and all this good stuff about nuclear future?
Sure. You can find a lot of my writing at the Breakthrough Journal, which is on Substack. I'm on Twitter at Econ Pragmatist. You can also find my personal website, williamdtilson.com. Um, and yeah, I'm on LinkedIn as well.
All right. Excellent. Thanks for being with us, Derek.
All right, thank you.